Well, welcome. It's awesome for you to join us. Some people have got some very interesting pictures, and some people are coming to us live, and that's awesome to see. Nice to see some familiar faces, David. So yeah, it's lovely to see everyone. I feel like if you've been to Intergenerate last week, I feel like yeah, we're getting good at this. But it's certainly a really helpful way to do something, definitely in the midst of COVID. And it's a great way for us to be able to bring in international speakers. So I know that there was about 35 to 36 people that have registered. And so people are kind of coming in dribbles now. And I'm not sure, is there anyone from somewhere other than Australia? Maybe raise your hand. Yep. So where are you from, Rachel? Do you want to?
Yeah, I'm New Zealand, Dunedin, right down south.
Awesome. Great. So the rest of us are Australian. Is that right? Yes, somewhat. Gosh, Braden French. Got a really nice Hamish face there. I'm just looking at all the pictures through speaker view so I can see you all coming on in. And here they come. So we're going to work on the same principle as we have in the past, and that is that I just want to let you know that this is recorded, and for that purposes, just so that you're aware and you're okay with that you will be a part of that by your face at times, and also that allows us to be able to put that up onto the website and for it to be a resource for other people. My name is Tammy, and Darren is with me, and we are a part of the Intergenerate Australia team. So we're very privileged to be able to have this space with you guys. If you do have questions, what we're going to do is we're going to ask Micheal to, when I introduce him in a minute, we're going to ask him to speak and to share with what he's come ready to share with. And if you have questions, put it in the chat, and Darren will kind of monitor that, and then there'll be plenty of time afterwards. We're not a big enough group that we're going to go off into chat rooms. We're actually going to stay together and be able to have kind of the discussion that's raised after whatever it is that Micheal wants to challenge us with. And my experience has been that he is very challenging, and that he's probably going to push us into places, and it will be good to just have that robust conversation. This is a safe place to be able to go, how do you feel about this, and how can we learn from each other? So on that note, I would like to introduce Micheal, and you can go on the website and you can go on Vibrant Faith and you can see all the things that he does. I met Micheal, I think it's almost just over 12 months ago. We were in the UK together. It's hard to imagine now that we couldn't do that even if we wanted to. And we spent a good intensive 24 hours together at a it was an international intergenerational roundtable, which is a big mouthful. But it was such a privilege. I loved his vitality, his energy. We connected straight away with the passions of the things that we talk about within Intergenerate. And I just found him to be a really, really real, engaging person. So for me, that's why I'm excited that he's here. And I know that I'm looking forward to what he's got to say. So I'm going to spotlight you, Micheal, and I'm going to let you take over.
Excellent. Well, it is really an honor to be here. I was just joking with Tammy and Darren earlier that it would be so much more pleasurable for me if I was actually in Australia, with you. But I do appreciate technology that allows me to come to where you are, and welcome to my office. You are in my office here in New Jersey. I live just outside of New York City. So that's where I live and serve. I have been in youth and family ministry for 30 years. This is my 30th year of doing this. I wish I could tell you that I started when I was 5. I did not, but it has been my entire career, 30 years of doing specifically youth ministry, but really involved in the youth and family ministry world. And just to give you a little picture of what has brought me here, it's really because of that amount of time that I've been in youth ministry. And so often when we experience youth ministers, maybe 5 years, maybe 10 years, a 20-year youth ministry veteran is somebody that's been in youth ministry for an incredibly long time. When you get to 30 years, you start to look back over your youth ministry career and start to ask some really serious questions. All of this conversation began because I was asking some of those questions. Those questions led me back to university, because one of the things that I was concerned about, and I don't know if any of you share this feeling, is that we've done really, really good youth ministry. I couldn't have lasted 30 years without being a reasonably good youth minister. I have memories of and photographs on my wall of incredible experiences, great youth groups and trips and relationships built, and it goes on and on and on about the experiences that we've had. In fact, yesterday, I went to the grocery store. My son had turned 22. And so I was buying him a birthday cake. And in the US, at least, everybody is wearing masks. So all you can see are people's eyes and their hair. So I'm walking up and I buy this birthday cake, and the baker behind the counter looks up and says, "Hey, Michael." And I'm like, "Yeah, absolutely." And all I can see is his eyes. I have no idea who it is. And he's like, "Oh, man." And he kind of pulls down his mask a little bit to reveal a kid that I knew 10 years ago, who is now a man. And he said to me what I hear so often from adults over the course of my career. And they say, "Oh, like, I remember being in your youth group, your youth ministry," whatever they say. And they always go, that was some of the best years of my life. Like, man, I miss you. And that was just really great. And find out that after their experience with me in youth ministry, they really didn't engage in a local church. They didn't get involved in a local ministry. And but they have these incredible memories of what it was like to be in the youth ministry that they had with me. Now, I don't know if any of you have had some similar experience, and my guess is that if you're coming to this particular workshop, that you are aware of some of those realities. But I went back to university. I went back to Drew University. There's a seminary at Drew, because I wanted to explore some of these questions about what's going on in youth ministry, what's going on in faith formation. And it was incredible, the things that I started to find. I had never heard the word intergenerational in my entire life. But as I started digging into ministry, I started to realize that ministry is really only effective in relationships and when the whole church is really involved. And what was amazing is that I wrote this thesis for Drew. Drew gave me this special dispensation to write a thesis on what's going on with youth ministry in the United States. And I came to discover this thing called Intergenerational Ministry, and wrote this whole thesis about it, and only to discover that there's some conversations that have been happening around the world as far as intergenerationality. And so I've been able to be part of the intergenerational community for, I would say, the last 5 years, 6 years or so. As Tammy said, I was able to meet a bunch of colleagues and realize that there's conversations around the world that are happening around intergenerationality. The thing that I discovered when it comes to these conversations is that there isn't a lot of conversation around teenagers, about what we do with teenagers. When you talk about intergenerational faith formation, too often we're talking about children, and we're talking about older adults and how they mix with kids. But there's this uncovered portion, there's this age group that we tend not to know what to do with, and that's this group of adolescents. And so I've been able to take all of these decades of youth ministry experience, and I've been able to marry them with intergenerationality and start to unpack some of the things that's going on. And that's the stuff that I want to share with you today. I'm going to share, I think I can share the screen now. Darren, is that correct? I can share the screen. So let's see if this works. And you all can kind of give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen. If is that working? Okay, it should say connecting teens to the church. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just start sharing these things. Now, I'm taking a lot of the things that I do in master classes. I also now this Drew University I was telling you about, where I graduated from, they've invited me back to teach this course at Drew, which has been really great. So I'm kind of taking this seminary course and some things I've been doing with Vibrant Faith, where I'm a staff coach and teacher. And I'm trying to boil it down into something that'll last us about 25 to 30 minutes, which will really be an extraordinary experience. So this is my plan today. I'm going to be giving you basically 3 principles for you to consider. If you've come here today hoping that you're going to find just some program or some tweaks or some things that you can do in order to connect teens to church, I pray that this isn't disappointing. It's not going to be little tweaks. These are going to be conversations about how we have to change the culture of our church life in order for us to really connect teens to our church, to connect adolescents to our church life. So basically, over the course of the next, let's say 30 minutes, I'm going to try and give you some 3 big principles. We're going to start with something that's easy to do, something that's medium hard to do, and then something that's super hard to do. But I will encourage you that if you do the easy thing and then work on the medium thing, you'll be 3/4 of the way to the hard thing. So be encouraged. So if you can work on these things, it's little bits of time. In addition, just to give you some framework, if you have questions, as your questions come up, Darren is going to be monitoring the chat. So as questions come up for you, feel free to add them into the chat, and we will provide some time when we are finished with the presentation, which I apologize. It'll be like giving you a drink of water through a fire hose. I realize that, but we're going to be able to give you a lot of principled information in a short amount of time, and then you can ask some follow-up questions if you would like. In addition, I know that I was just talking with Tammy about some further conversations. Feel free to reach out to Tammy after this is all done and say, I'd like to have some further conversations around these issues, and she can certainly connect us and we can figure it out. All right, that's all the housekeeping that we need to do today. So welcome to Connecting Teens to the Church. So in the U.S., we kind of have a saying that the first step to healing is admitting that there's a problem. And that really becomes the most important part. And largely in the church, we have a really hard time admitting that we have a problem. But to frame the problem a little bit better, I want to kind of give us this idea. So youth ministry, for the most part, has been a huge priority in the church. And it's going back to about the 1960s. These are really primarily looked at the 2 guys that are the leaders in developing what we know as youth ministry in the church. This is Mike Yaconelli and Wayne Rice, founders of Youth Specialties. And Youth Specialties throughout the 1970s and 80s, when I was coming up in youth ministry in the 80s and the 90s, they were the Cadillac. They were the ones who understood how to do youth ministry. And youth ministry has grown around the world as this incredible force. Every church that I know of wants to have a youth group that's vibrant and it's filled with lots of kids. And a really good church, of course, has a youth pastor. I mean, what church doesn't have a youth pastor? What church worth its salt doesn't have a youth pastor? And of course, when you do that, you're creating this Christian youth culture. You take them to youth concerts, there's youth curriculum, there's youth experiences, there's youth everything. Now, logically speaking, if we were pouring this much effort and finances and resources into youth ministry, we should have the most vibrant and growing church that history has ever known. We don't. What we have is, of course, the knowledge that we already know, that 85% of people who are following Jesus made their faith decision before the age of 14. We know that. That's why we pour all kinds of information or all kinds of resources and time into children's ministry. But there's another statistic that is quite frankly quite distressing, and that's this: the majority of those who lived as a part of a faith community and they left did so by the age of 18. That means that between the ages of 14 and 18, there's something happening. And I will send this PowerPoint to Tammy so that she will have this PowerPoint and she can share some of these slides with you. You're welcome to have this PowerPoint after we're done. If you're just furiously trying to write down information, I totally get that. That'll be uploaded to you later on. So the question is that what is happening in this particular window of time? So if we have all of these people that are coming to faith in childhood and then somehow losing connection with the church, and notice I don't say losing faith. None of these kids that I run into that are not connected to the church would be people who have lost faith. They still love God. They still have these great experiences. They still pray. They just don't have a connection to the local church. And so the question is, so why are we investing all of this time in childhood ministry, but not necessarily finding the results carrying on into adulthood? So the first principle that I want to deliver to you is to understand what's going on developmentally for teens. Now, if you've been involved in youth ministry for a long time, some of this stuff is going to be very elementary to you. So I apologize if I'm covering over bases you already know. But in youth ministry, most children's ministry is catechistic. And what I mean is that you are delivering information to children. You're teaching them about God, you're teaching them about the Bible, you're teaching them about prayer, and it's very top down. Something happens when people end up I would say about 12 to 14 years old. A shift happens in their thinking, and they're starting to ask why questions. And often in the church, we're not prepared for those why questions, but these are some of the key questions that they're really answering. First of all, they're trying to answer the question of who am I? This primarily is a question of identity. In fact, it can be argued that all of the questions that I'm about to introduce you to have to do with identity. See, when you're a child, your parents are telling you who you are. Your teachers are telling you who you are. The adults in your world are telling you who you are. When you reach early adolescence, you are starting to ask the question of whether or not you believe what your parents have told you, of what the adults in your life have told you. And you're trying to ask questions about who am I? And often when you're asking the questions about who am I, you're really ultimately asking a question about who are you? And that's a question of belonging. So if I'm looking at my parents who've been telling me something about myself my entire life, and now I'm starting to really wonder who I actually am, now I have to question who you are. Who are you, mom? Who are you, dad? Who are you, pastor? Who are you, youth leader? Who are you, teacher? Because now I'm trying to understand my relationship to these people that have been in my life. You know, you often hear of something like teenage rebellion. I argue that sometimes you get rebellious teens, but that's a rare thing. For the most part, adults misunderstand differentiation, trying to self-identify as rebellion. They're trying to figure out who they are and their relationship to you. It's not rebellion. It's just kind of a natural development of establishing their own identity. So as they're asking, who am I? Who are you? And then in the case of their belonging, they're ultimately also asking the question of where do I fit, which is a question of purpose. That's a question a child is not asking. A child is not asking, what's my purpose in life? How do I make impact in the world? But a teenager, as they're emerging, are trying to identify what their place in the world is. What is their value? What is their contribution? And so as we start with youth ministry, even beyond how we develop youth ministry, it's not necessarily do we do a youth group or do we not do a youth group, do we do whatever. Our youth ministries have to identify these central questions of identity if we're really going to establish a connection space with teenagers within our church community. If churches aren't able to dialogue with adolescents about their identity, they are going to find an identity elsewhere. I think we're clear with that. And that's what we've seen. We've seen teenagers identify elsewhere, whether it's on social media, whether it's on their peer group, whether it's in another kind of community. They are looking for a place where people can help them develop an identity. And often our catechistic approach that we do with children, if we try and apply that to teens, that's going to be unsatisfying because they're going to resist the idea of being told what to do and who they are. They want to be able to have a place to wrestle with these ideas. So I want to share with you some quick findings. And I will also send this to Tammy if Tammy would like to. So this is an article called Adolescent Identity Development. This is by Joanna Lee Williams, which is out of the University of Virginia in the United States. Just an adolescent scholar, really, really fantastic writer. She identifies these stages of adolescence. I'm only going to do two because I think they apply to us. To understand early adolescence, so that's at ages of 11 to 14. This is often that space, if you are in a church that practices confirmation, this is kind of that confirmation age for some of you that practice that kind of thing. What they are trying to do is identify themselves in multiple ways outside of the family. We've just talked about that. For a child, the family is everything. Mom is everything. Dad is everything. Siblings, those are our primary playmates. As an adolescent starts to develop, they start to realize that they are identifying beyond their family role. They're also identifying themselves as part of a peer group. They're understanding that there are other people their age and having some experiences. If you are in youth ministry, these are elementary to you. You understand that already. They're also beginning to develop a flexibility in how they present themselves in certain situations. That is the definition of the awkward middle schooler. The one who is combing their hair weird and their clothes just kind of don't fit and they're presenting themselves in really weird ways. That's because they are trying to figure out how to present themselves in a way that is acceptable to this new group of people that they begin to recognize. They don't care how they look in front of mom or dad or siblings. They start to care how they are defining themselves with peers, with other adults in their lives, and they're really starting to care about how they present themselves in situations. Their personal values are also starting to morph, and that's based on how they see themselves. How many 11 or 12-year-olds have you seen starting to struggle with, is it time to give up my toys yet? And starting to really struggle with what that means about leaving childhood and moving into this adolescent stage. What is cool? What is not cool? And starting to identify some of those things. Those are those internal struggles. And what those are, it all comes down to how we are forming an identity, how we see ourselves. And they also are starting to experience a greater sensitivity to feedback, especially from peers. And here becomes a really key thing that I often see a mistake in what we call youth ministry. And notice when I say youth ministry, I'm not saying youth group. I'm saying the ministry that we have with adolescents. I have often seen youth ministries and youth ministers and others make fun of young teens. Let's admit it, that these young teens are hysterical, often not on purpose. You know, like they're just tripping over themselves and they do funny things and they're awkward and they're weird. And sometimes we exploit that. Let's be honest, like we often exploit these young teenagers and that we are not having fun with them. We are having fun at their expense. We have to recognize that in this tender stage of identity formation, their sensitivity to the feedback that they are receiving from other people is going to be key to their development. Be very aware of how you treat these young teenagers. Now, moving on to the next stage. Notice that Williams identifies 14 to 18 as middle adolescents. If you've been in youth ministry for even close to as long as I have, that becomes shocking to you that this is called middle adolescence. Because when we all started in youth ministry, this was called late adolescence. That's what this was, 14 to 18. However, middle adolescence is a formation of the wealth and opportunities that's starting to happen within the developed world. See, adolescence is something that wasn't invented until the early 1900s. Before that, there was just childhood and there was adulthood. But because of certain changes that happened as a result of the Industrial Revolution, particularly child labor laws and things like that, all of a sudden there was this somewhat idle class. The solution was to send them to school. The invention of high school and secondary education occurred. And within that sense of secondary education, you created a brand new social class, a brand new collection of people that didn't exist in the 1800s and before. And in 1903, there was a sociologist who called this adolescence for the first time, 1903. And so we haven't had adolescence with us for a very long time. And adolescence is really largely defined, and I hope that you can receive it, is largely defined not by actual physiology, but defined by economics. Because we have the wealth and we have the educational opportunity to extend adolescence in much, much, much deeper into adulthood. So this is called middle adolescence because now adolescence is stretching well into the college years and beyond, because we in Western culture can afford to keep our children in this suspended state of growth. I wrote a whole paper on the concept of adulting. Is that something that you hear in Australia and New Zealand, adulting? Adulting is the most horrifying thing that I've ever heard. And it's basically a 20-something, when they're doing something that's responsible, they'll say, I'm adulting. And I always respond like, no, you're an adult. Like that, you know, that you're just being an adult. Like that's what that is. But it's because of that recognition that we are extending adolescence well into adulthood. All right, that was free. I'm going to toss that out there. So middle adolescence. Middle adolescence, most of what we consider youth ministry, they're beginning to imagine their own adolescent identity and their role in the larger world. So as the young ones are starting to just look at peers and the people that are close to them, now older ones are starting to see themselves globally, especially in our digital and global world. They're starting to see themselves as a part of a global community. And that's huge. That's well beyond the family. They're actively exploring identity alternatives, trying on different hats, as it were, the expression trying on different hats. That's when you often see, it's like, oh, my kid's in the punk rock stage, or my kid's in the emo stage, or my kid's in whatever stage they're in. They're trying on different identity expressions to try and figure out what fits. And again, I encourage you as youth ministers, do not shut this expression down. Encourage them to try and ask questions about what it is that they're trying to discover. Who is it they're trying to be? I don't care if they dye their hair purple. Ask them why. What's going on for them? Explore that question. Not why in a judgmental sense. Tell me more about that. The Dutch have a phrase called vertel us. Like, just vertel us. Like, give me more of that. Like, expand on that, because I want to know more about you. So they're trying on these different hats. They're also reconsidering. It says consider themselves. I think a fair phrase is to reconsider themselves and their beliefs in relation to broader social cultural groups like gender, race, and religion. This is when you're in later adolescence, you're starting to hear things that you haven't heard from them before. They're asking questions about gender identity and sexual identity and their relationship with other racial groups and social groups. They're starting to ask this question because they're starting to realize that the world is filled with pain. They're starting to realize that the world is filled with other alternatives and brokenness. And they're starting to ask the question of how we, our group, the group I grew up in, how do I relate to these other people groups? And do I identify with these groups that I see out there? And that's an important conversation that we have, that quite frankly, as you're developing that with your teens, don't be afraid of that, because that's actually going to lead to some extraordinary opportunities for ministry in the greater community. So I think that's a great thing. So keep focus on that. Secondly, and this applies to that, they're taking stronger stances on social, ethical, and moral issues. That's when all of a sudden the kid that was playing games or whatever and was happy to fill his mouth with marshmallows, or he's talking about crazy stuff, all of a sudden becomes an activist. Like he's talking about global warming and talking about Black Lives Matter and talking about all kinds of things, because they've identified themselves as part of this global community, and they're seeing what's going on in the world, and they're starting to take stands. And in some ways, they identify some of their stands as being opposed to the stands of the traditional values of which they grew up. Because often if there is a problem in the world, it's because the current ruling class, the current class in power, hasn't done anything about these social issues. And so they see themselves as people that are wanting to change the world, to change the situation. They see their values as differing from the world around them. And then finally, they find themselves with an increased stability of how they see themselves across different places and social groups. I find that when I take teenagers cross-culturally, and when I have some of their parents or other older adults, there's a place, Camden, New Jersey, that's not too far from it. It is one of the most notorious urban communities in the United States. And I take students there for about a week to go live in Camden for the week. The teens, no problem. They're able to talk with people and engage with people. It's the adults that are having a little bit of a struggle of trying to figure out how they relate. Teenagers tend not to have a problem engaging with people from other places and social groups. So that's some of the stuff that's happening developmentally for the people that you are trying to reach. So that's principle number one, just identifying the fact that whenever we call our youth ministry, it has to address the issues of identity development. If we are not giving our teenagers the ability to develop identity within the church, they will develop identity somewhere else. That we cannot be surprised when all we do is we have youth group and we have a bunch of fun and we teach them the Bible and how to pray and all that, but we've given them no connection with the greater church. We cannot be surprised if they eventually fade away because they've identified somewhere else. Okay, so that's principle one. Yeah, I'm just running through these. Darren, is there anything we need to address before we move to the next one? You are muted, my friend.
I unmuted myself. Just one big question coming through I saw which may be relevant is, how does this work by Joanna Lee Williams address LGBTQI issues for these young adults?
Yeah, and I mean, we're going to get to some of that. I'm not sure the foundation of the question. Because I realize I may be talking to people whose opinions lie in lots of different places. For me, I come from a biblically open and affirming place when it comes to LGBTQIA issues. I think God receives them and loves them, and it's our job to invite them into the kingdom as they are. Our job is to teach them about love, not about who they love. So I recognize I'm coming from a different place. But if that's where your question is, then yes, that is a part of the church's life, is to help them develop that sense of identity as they are trying to understand their own sexuality and how that plays in. And that applies to race. That applies to really every area of life, is that really giving them a safe place to develop their identity and not shut it down.
Amanda asked a follow-up, is there a delayed development in terms of trans kids, e.g. may a 16-year-old who comes out be in the early adolescent stage?
Yeah, and that's more cultural than physiological. I think when we've found, I should say this, psychologically and sociologically, if a child who is trans is growing up in an accepting family and growing up in an accepting environment, their development is not delayed. It's what we call arrested development. And this doesn't necessarily apply just to the trans community or to the gay community. Any kid that is abused or shut down or marginalized is going to have an arrested development. That's just going to happen. They're going to have issues that cause a delay in their development, because they've got to feel that level of acceptance. You all are probably familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. For us to really truly feel a sense of self-actualization, we have to feel a sense of safety and a sense of acceptance, a sense of belonging for us to really get there. And that's really where the church can come into play. The church can provide this safe place for students that are growing up and realizing that their identities, whatever their identities are, whether it's sexual or racial or social or economic, whatever it is that their, say, non-mainstream identities are, or their mainstream identities, that we can provide them a safe place to develop those identities. And that actually assists in their own psychological development. You are exactly right. There is a delay often for trans kids as they develop into adulthood, but that doesn't have to do with the fact that they're trans. It has to do with the fact that the community in which they grow is not giving them the ability, the safety that they need to be able to develop as adults. That's primarily what.
Okay. And then Christos, this may be coming up for you soon, I'm not sure you can mention or not down the track, but he's asking what are the pros and cons of compartmentalizing mid-adolescence and this in late adolescence? Like what's the pros and cons of doing this, like putting them into these boxes?
No, and that's great. And yeah, let me be really clear. This is not a compartmentalization, and it's not like often, you know, like you get 11 to 14, and then all of a sudden at 14, they switch to all of a sudden having these issues. We're all in this transient stage. This is not about compartmentalization. This is about awareness of some of the things that are going on generally for people. As we pointed out, there are different factors that delay or accelerate development based on the experiences that we have had. That's why when we say adolescence, and in brackets, there's some general ages that these are happening. Not everybody it's happening at 14, not everybody it's happening at 18, not everybody it's happening at 11. But to be aware of the stages of growth. If adolescence is a socially constructed thing, that means that people can enter and leave adolescence at very different chronological ages. But there is this recognition of the kind of the natural stages of moving from childhood to adulthood, and how we can engage kids wherever they are in the process, how we can engage them in those stages of development, just to be aware of what's going on. Great questions. Yeah, really excellent questions. This is way more fun. I will tell you, just to blow up Australia and New Zealand, I just did this for United States. Oh man, the questions were hardly anything, you know, and I had like 85 people. These are such engaging questions. I love them so much. And so this is so fun. I'll come back anytime. All right, so the second question. So we're looking at how we do identity development. That becomes the first step in really developing a quality youth ministry. Again, not youth group, but youth ministry that connects kids to the church, because they start to identify their own identity development within the church and not outside the church. But there's a second factor that becomes really important in this identity process. And that is simply this, is that the church, when we're talking about connecting people, is that we need to know our own why. Let me explain what I mean by that. Often when teenagers are developing their own sense of identity, and if they live in a youth group environment, often that's a safe place, and that's great. It's the translation from the youth ministry or the youth group to the greater church that we often find the most breakdown. And that's because the church has a very difficult time articulating its own why, like why we exist. This is what I mean by that. We love to teach tools, prayer, Bible study, worship, all of that stuff. We're great at teaching the tools of Christianity. And those tools are all there to help us understand the kingdom and calling of God. That's why they exist. But without a clear articulation of purpose, they become religious ritual that provide little meaning to teenagers. You know, when teenagers are told, well, you got to pray or you got to read the Bible. And then they say, well, why? And we don't have a reason other than, you know, you make God sad, you know, like, you know, and they know that's not true. You know, they know they're not making God sad, you know, and that's a weird thing to tell a kid anyway. Like, God just wants this for you. Well, that's not inspiring. That's not engaging. And we know theologically that's not the case. That all of these things, the things that we do that are the acts of the church, the rituals of the church, the traditions of the church, are all designed to help us become people that understand the kingdom work and calling of God. Another way to look at it is simply the Missio Dei. That just means the mission of God or the ministry of God in the world. If it's a good way to understand it, the church doesn't exist to make us feel good. The church does, and it does. The church, that's not why the church exists. The church doesn't exist to give a place for moral people to come and be moral for an hour and a half on a Sunday. It doesn't exist as a community institution, so the community feels good about itself. The church exists to be an expression of the mission of God. Jesus said, greater things will you do than I do. When he was talking to his disciples, he's saying that I am calling together my church, and my church will go farther in the world than I have gone, because you're carrying my spirit into the world. We are carrying on the mission of God. And the church, by and large, has a hard time articulating what that means. What does it mean to be the church in our community? And we need to get back. If we are going to connect teens to church, we need to understand our own mission. This principle has almost nothing to do with teenagers themselves. It has to do with who we are. So if we want to recognize the identity formation that's happening with teens, we need to understand our own identity if we're going to share that identity with teens. So again, this is what I mean. The church exists as an extension of the mission of God in the world, and we are the representatives. That's what we just said. That is the whole existence of the church. And I want to encourage you to go back to your congregations, and you can do this over Zoom. You can do this over phone calls. You can do this in the middle of a pandemic. And I say this from an intense pandemic concentrated section. Like we can do this work, and we can have these conversations to say, if we are the mission of God, what does that mean? What does that mean? What do we do? Why do we matter in our community? In our community, we're saying with protests going on all over the place and Black Lives Matter, like, what does it mean to be the church in the middle of the Black Lives Matter movement? What does it mean to be the church in Pride Month, which is June? What does it mean to be the church in a time where our government is putting refugee or immigrants in cages? You know, like, what does that mean? What does it mean to be the church? And Australians and New Zealanders have to ask the same question. What does it mean to be the church in our community where people are hungry, where people are hurting, where people are broken, where people are lost, where people are being abused, go on and so forth? What is the mission of God in our community? And as members of the local church, the mission of God in the world, whatever the answer to that question is, and really, if you're wanting to know what the answer to the question is, find out what people are praying. Like when people say, what are the prayer requests in the world? What are people praying for? And I often say to people in my pastoral prayers, as people are saying, oh, well, I'm concerned about hunger, I'm concerned about this, I often pray, and God, show us what you've called us to do to be the answer to that prayer. Because quite often we're asking God to do something that God has already answered. So through us. So as members of the local church, the mission of God in the world is our mission, and our ministry with the young is no different than the larger mission of God. And this is what I mean by that. We in Faith Formation, here's the definition of Faith Formation. Faith Formation are seeking ways to invite our young along on the mission of God. So you've got that, right? So we're participating in a grand mission of God. And as members of the local church, we're the representatives of that mission. And all Faith Formation is telling our young, come with us while we are the mission of God. And let me show you how to do this. And I will tell you that 90% of your questions about youth ministry will be solved with just that question. If you can do that, I will promise you that that will be an amazing experience. So here's your homework. Ask your church this: why does your church or the church exist? So if you can cover that principle, recognize identity formation, and then take this question really seriously, I will tell you, you are 90% of the way there, because I'm about to tell you something really, really hard. So this is the small hard, this is the medium hard. I'm about to get to the really, really hard. Okay, so let's frame this once you get the question why. So here's some questions. Once you've established that mission of God, you're gonna start to ask some preparatory questions. Here's one. Do the rituals, traditions, and programming of your church support this question? So now you've just established the why, who we are. Do our rituals, traditions, and programming support the purpose that you have just articulated? Or is it just something that we've always done? Is it something that makes people feel good? Is it just a tradition? Or is it truly supporting the Missio Dei of your church? Then the question is, what methods of doing church become open to change to better do the why? And that includes digital and non-gathered experiences. For us, we are in the middle of a pandemic, and I am brokenhearted about the people who are sick and dying. Don't get me wrong about what I'm about to say, but there's a piece of this pandemic that I'm like, thank you. Like, thank you for this pandemic, because we have wiped away all of the traditions out of our church, and we are having to completely rethink how we do church. And that includes digital methods and the things that we're doing that are non-gathered. I can tell you that after this pandemic, at least in the United States, we are never going to gather the way that we did. We were barely hanging on before the pandemic. People are not returning to the church the same way that they did. So how can we do church in a way that accomplishes the mission of God, but recognizing we are now in the 21st century? We are hopefully soon in a post-pandemic world. We are in a digital age. What does it mean to do church differently? And then is there room for other voices to help shape your expression of calling? You're going to see that I'm getting to a power conversation, because that's going to be a huge part of our conversation about the church, this power conversation. Is there room for other voices to help express that? And how exclusive or inclusive is this sense of calling and purpose? Do only a few people define that for your church, or is it a little bit broader? All right, so Darren, before I go to that final principle, is there anything we need to address right now? He is muted. Darren, you are muted.
David Baxton asked a good question. A question about youth pastor. How do churches move from token gestures of involvement to full integration for our teens, adolescents? Given a healthy understanding of intergen ministry, what might this involvement look like from week to week? Is that something you're going to answer coming up, or not answer that one now?
That answer is coming up.
Okay,
right.
Good.
Yeah.
And Christos came back to clarify his question. What he meant was, what are the pros and cons of ministries compartmentalizing youth ministry, e.g. youth leaving at 18, but it's the same age we are asking to join a new 18 plus ministry? It's like creating new ministries. So in other words, we're now creating young adult ministries and older young adult ministries. Is that a good way to go or not?
Yeah, I am. So I just realized the time. I'm going to try and answer this really quickly and honor the time that we have. And I apologize, Tammy, I realize what time it is. I want to honor the time that you've given us to do. So I've practiced what's called age and stage, what you're talking about, compartmentalization. I've practiced age and stage through a lot of my career. And that really is the thing that largely is damaging the church growing and going forward. The reason I'm intergenerational is because we have misunderstood what the purpose, I think, of the church largely is. And that is, the church is a gathering of God's people to grow together, to be able to accomplish the calling and mission of God. Age and stage is a product of the Industrial Revolution. It's a factory model of education. So if you can picture, we didn't have this kind of educational model until we developed the factory model, the Industrial Revolution, where we take a little part and then grow it into another part, another part, another part. And we started practicing faith formation the same way, thinking that if we just concentrated our efforts in particular ages along the stage, that we would grow mature Christians. We have found that that's not true, because that's not how people grow. People don't do that. People grow better in community. People grow better messy. People grow better wrestling with things, learning from one another. And that is how we grow as a church, because God's goal is not smart Christians. God's goal is Christians that learn how to love one another and learn how to pool their resources and gifts in order to accomplish the mission that God has called them to. So if we keep separating all of our gifts, all of our resources into little tiny rooms, and we never experience them together, and we never grow together, we never do theology together, we never do worship together, then the church is always going to be stunted and arrested, because we're never going to have all the gifts in one room. We might end up with smart Christians, but we're not going to end up with spirit-filled, effective Christians. So I have to say that. Okay. All right, for the sake of time, I'm going to rush through. You are all welcome to keep engaging with me. I'm going to finish my time. I will stay here as long as you want to stay here and ask questions, but I'll finish my content for anyone that feels like they need to peel off. Is that okay, Tammy? Is that fair? Okay. Okay, so that final question, which we were starting to get to, is, so how do we do this? It all comes down to a word that I use, inclusion, of how do we practice inclusion. And inclusion becomes a buzzword in the church, and often we're talking about marginalized people groups. How do we practice inclusion with people that have been marginalized and included? We practice that, and this is something we tend to ignore. How do we ignore this with children when we're practicing it with other people? Let me throw this up there. There's a difference between diversity and inclusion. A church with multiple programs for multiple ages is practicing diversity. They are not practicing inclusion. There is a difference. Diversity means I have lots of puzzle pieces for all kinds of people. You know, we were talking about the LGBTQIA community. Can you imagine you put up a pride flag outside and you advertise that you're an inclusive community? And then when a gay couple comes in, you're like, great, we are so happy that you're here. The gay room is downstairs. Like, we would never consider that. Because if we're talking about being inclusive, or whether it's an Aboriginal community or whether it's poor people or whatever, that we wouldn't consider putting them in a separate place, because what we're doing is we're wanting to say, how do we include them? How do we include them into the fabric and tapestry of our lives? It's the same principle that we're talking about practicing with the young. Inclusion means that we view everyone as essential to who we are as a community, and we intentionally work to go where we go as one. That means that if somebody is left behind, we are not going forward until all of us can be a part of the community. That's a conversation we're having in the United States about Black Lives Matter. Until everyone matters, all lives don't matter until everyone matters. Like, that's really what we're doing. And so we're blowing up a people group that hasn't mattered to largely in our culture, because we are not practicing liberty and equality until everyone has liberty and equality, until they really matter. And we really have to practice that in our church. There's a difference between valuing people and considering them vital. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a minute. And that has to do with access. Access, we find ways to include all ages in the core life of our congregation. If you practice confirmation, you are saying to an 8th grader that you are now a full-fledged member of this church. And then that we say to that 8th grader, great, now you get to go to youth group, and go to a different room, go to a different place. It's like we give them this birthright and then we take it away, instead of finding a way to integrate them into every aspect of our congregational life. I've started an intern program, post-confirmation. You end with confirmation, 2 years, choose an area of ministry that you want to be a part of. And when you graduate, you invest yourself in that area of ministry, and you have mentors and leaders. And that's what you have to do. Like, how do you involve people in the core life of your congregation? And then finally, you give them agency. So there's inclusion, which means we recognize that they're intentional. We want to involve them in everything. But what about decision making? That's when it comes down to power. is that agency is defined as being able to make choices and decisions to influence events and to have an impact in one's world. How many 16-year-olds have an influential voice in your church that are able to make decisions and that their heart, their voice, their thoughts are being taken seriously? I'm going to go quickly past this next slide about intergenerational ministry. I'll give you this definition real quick. This is my definition of intergenerational ministry. Intergenerational congregations are those who consider each age cohort as theologically vital in the life, growth, and worship of a congregation as a whole. And we actively seek out ways to integrate every age into congregational life. If you are just having dinners that involve old people and young people, that's not an intergenerational congregation. An intergenerational congregation is one that takes every age cohort, and that includes our 85-year-olds, every age cohort seriously, and we involve them intentionally in the life of our congregation. All right, quickly, I know that I'm at time. I want to just give you one more thought, and then I'll let it go. I'm going to skip this. This is the Developmental Relationships of the Search Institute. Look up that on your own. But I want to pull out the one idea that I think is really important, this idea of sharing power. This is where we really have to make some conversations happen within our church. Sharing power means that you respect me, that you include me, that you're willing to collaborate with me, and that you'll let me lead. Picture the 15, 16, 17, 18-year-olds in your church. Do they have these experiences within your congregation? Are they respected? Are they included? Do they collaborate with every member of your congregation? And do they have leadership? Are they allowed to lead within your congregation? If they are not, we're not sharing power with them. And I will tell you, they have power that needs to be shared, and they will find another place to do it outside of our church. And that's largely what's been happening. So just a review, connecting teens, we recognize their identity formation, be clear of your own congregational sense of the Missio Dei, and be able to articulate that call. That should be in all of your literature, everything that you do, articulate who you are, and really develop a culture of inclusion where you feel their voice is heard, their contribution is vital. Are you practicing corporate identity formation? It's just another word for intergenerational ministry, corporate identity formation. And are the power positions open to young leadership and influence? That is 8:01, according to my time, or 10:01, according to your time. So that is my presentation. And like I said, if you've got to peel off, if you've basically given me an hour, like that's fine and you have to go. But Tammy, I'm here, and Darren, I'm here if anybody has some questions that you want to engage.
Micheal, again, such wisdom, so much. Some of your statements are just gold, and I just really appreciate that. And don't apologize, because you've done questions within. So, you know, that's where your time goes, and that's the interaction piece. And so don't apologize for that. And yeah, as you said, people can go when they want to. That's the joy of chat rooms. So but we've got space and time. So Darren, if you wanted to prompt some of the questions that haven't been answered, or prompt someone to ask a question in particular, then let's go for it, because I don't know where you start. There was just so much. I need to go home and I'm home. I need to sit and digest and watch again. I just so appreciate some of the profound principles that you've brought out.
Yes, I agree. That's powerful, Micheal. I'm just blown away, especially with your last comment. I'm talking about the grab, our teens have power to share. Yeah. And if we don't allow them to share power in our churches, they'll find somewhere else to share that. That just blows me away. It's spot on. But some questions coming through. Phil Harland asked one about Missio Dei earlier. Phil, you want to unmute yourself and ask that question? Is Phil still there?
Yep, he is there. I can see Philip Highland. Is that who it is?
Yep.
I've got to remember what my question was again.
All the skiing behind you. And skiing has messed up your mind behind you there.
Yeah, that's where I want to be. Basically, I think that the question was in relation to each generational group Missio Dei, how do we navigate that with each generation? Because each generation has a different Missio Dei, and that's very hard to navigate at times. How do we do that?
Yeah, and that's become some of the blessing of the conversation. So that's where when we come to share power and we come to that sense of inclusion, the church, you ask people generally in culture about the church, and most people will answer with some form of irrelevance, that the church doesn't necessarily have relevance in its community. And that's largely because we're not doing that conversation, that wrestling. I have a friend of mine, a colleague, who called it creative tension. We're not working on that creative tension because there's always that space. If I have an idea and you have an idea and we're trying to find that space in order to have a corporate idea, like a shared understanding, that takes some time. That takes some work, and that takes some compromise, and that takes some wrestling. And that becomes the beautiful work of the church. If you've got people that are willing to do it, and that goes with kids too. Sometimes kids aren't willing because they've been shut down by adults for so much of their life that they're like, yeah, I'm not interested. And so it might take some small conversations, to maybe get with some teen allies who are willing to put in the work with you as an advocate, and some adult allies that are willing to come on and just have those small conversations and start working on these. Because relevance happens over the course of time. Because what was relevant 50 years ago was absolutely relevant and was absolutely important 50 years ago. And so what happens in the church so often is we go, this was relevant 50 years ago. We're going to write a constitution, and this is what we're going to do. And this is what we're going to do forever and ever and ever. But with every culture change, it's not like theology changes, but our emphases change. Our mission changes. And so that's when we wrestle with the young and say, what is your generation saying? What is the Spirit of God saying to your generation? And let's collaborate on what that means so we can formulate a mission of God for our church that includes all of our voices. And it's hard work. I'm not going to lie to you. It's hard work, but it's good work. It's really good work.
Yep. David
Thank you.
Buxton's asking, how do churches move from token gestures of involvement, and we all know what they look like, to full integration for our teens, adolescents?
Yeah, there are people in power you have to identify. Often those kind of token things are because people want to say that we've got a youth ministry, or we've got a youth group, or they go on mission trips or things like that. And youth practitioners know that it's not necessarily as effective as you'd want it to be, but people love to say that that's what they have. That's their token group. But you have to identify who are the power people in your congregation. One power group would be whoever is those pillars of your congregation, whoever it is that really holds sway in how things happen. You have to bring them into the conversation. One of the power brokers in the church where I serve, I finally went toe-to-toe with him and I said, I know you love this church. And I can tell you that you keep talking about this church shrinking and shrinking. If we don't invite the young to the conversation, you and I will still be alive when we lock this church door for the last time. Is that what you want? And so if either we have to open up the avenues of power, or we can just watch this church continue to die until the last person dies, and then we can just sell the building to a nightclub. Who will love the space. They'll think the space is great. The second people of power would be parents. Parents, you have to bring in on the conversation, because sometimes it's parents who are the ones who like the token. They like to know that there's a youth group at their church. But they have their kids involved in so many things. You have to bring them into the conversation and say, why are we doing this? Why do I want your kid to choose being on the church board rather than play road baseball? That's an American, but kind of road baseball, whatever that is, to be involved in something extracurricular and to bring them into the conversation. And then you have to bring some key teens into the conversation. Give them a bigger vision of where we're going and what we're doing, because it's going to cost that teenager. It absolutely will cost the teenager to be able to be involved in that. So you have to get a few of those power representatives into a conversation and covenant together that we are going to do this. And then eventually, after a long time, it'll stop being a token thing.
Another one here's a biggie. I'm not sure I've got time today to go into it. If you don't want to, maybe it's a future webinar. But Raymond Aga's asked, I currently pastor ethnic churches. Have you found similar findings in ethnic churches with what you have presented?
Great question. Oh my goodness, my heart is bursting. So in my research, so now we're going to talk about like a little bit of my PhD research. My PhD research really focuses on how different ethnic groups are practicing faith formation. And what we find, so in the American context, and I don't know if this is true in the Aboriginal context or in other people groups that you have in Australia, is that faith formation, the statistics where they're losing people are not happening in the African American community, in the Latinx community. They're not happening because what they have established is family, relational, emotional connections to their faith community. They are sharing power. If you walk into an African American church, you will not see just adults on the dais. You will see a 9-year-old kid playing drums. You will see young teenagers doing the dance ministry. You will see all kinds of people from young to old worshiping together and serving together. They don't have children's church. They don't have all that stuff. They are worshiping together as one community. And then as worship is often, quite frankly, they tend to go from church to dinner at somebody's house. And they all serve together. They eat together. They celebrate together. In the typically like European Western congregations, we like to go for about an hour, do our church thing and leave. That's not how you do faith formation. And so we find that there is actually a lot to learn that the kind of Western European Caucasian community can actually learn a lot by looking at, and I'm gonna suggest that probably the Aboriginal community is going to be real similar to that, to the Native community. Look at how they practice not just faith formation, look at how they practice passing along values from one generation to another, how they practice intergenerational, how they practice community. And I will tell you, if you can just start practicing those things, the game will change. Absolutely.
Yep. A number of people are asking, they love what you presented. Your dissertation or your thesis, have you got any published work yet of what you've been doing that we can have a look at?
Sure. Actually, I can offer some of my thesis work. I'm published in 2 works right now. One is it's a work, Corey Seibel, Seibel, is the editor. It's called The Generative Church. So I published there a look at really looking at this idea of what I just talked about, the African American community, the Latinx community, and how we're practicing intergenerationality across cultures. The Generative Church is a great book because it is international scholars, all writing from different parts of the world, Australia, South Africa, London, the United States, Canada, all people writing on the subject of generationality. Coming soon, there's actually Intergenerate 2.0. I've got a published work in Intergenerate 2.0, so keep an eye out for that. And you can also, if you join the Vibrant Faith Catalyst, a lot of my webinars and things like that are up there too. So that's there, but I can keep you tuned in wherever you want to go.
We'll put those links for Vibrant Faith on the website, Tammy, I think, and Intergenerate 2.0, that's the American Intergenerate gathering.
So so the Intergenerate conference. So Intergenerate 2, it's been delayed because of the pandemic, but it's going to be coming out within early 2021. So keep an eye out for that. So that's definitely there. But within the Intergenerate website, I think you can get to the webinars that I did there. I did a similar webinar there, but you can also email me. I will. M Droege. So my name, you see Micheal Droege in my name box right there. If you went mdroege@vibrantfaith.org, email me. I will email you more resources pertaining to your question than you could possibly want or imagine. So I'm happy to help.
Good. Those links are already on the website. They've been there for a while.
Great.
Yeah.
Great.
I think that's about it for the questions. I'm seeing someone else I've missed. Someone's put their hand up quickly. Unmute yourself and ask the question. No, I think we're at an end.
Excellent.
Fantastic.
Excellent.
You know, again, I just really appreciate what a valuable kind of hour and a half or hour and a piece that we've had together. And, you know, it's then just taking that and really kind of chewing on it and working it through within your context. So that is my prayer for all of us. And maybe that might be a great way for me to finish, just to be able to really say, let's just kind of give this to God and know he's been listening and been a part of it all. But Lord, we just really thank you for the chance to connect with those that are on this journey and far and wide. We thank you, Lord, for the hard things that we've heard, for the inspiring things that we've heard. And Lord, mostly we know that the hard work is when we actually start to apply that in our own faith community. So Lord, let us have the strength and the courage and the inspiration to know how to move forward, what is the next best step, and how we can really engage not only all ages, but also our teens, that we are on this mission together and that we ask them to come along with us. What a beautiful statement. Simple, and yet we know that is not only the call, but it is also the challenge. And so, Lord, we just ask that you would just help us to be a part of the journey forward and not be, and to be the bridges that we need to be, not the barriers, not the walls, in the positions that we hold and in the voices and the spaces that we get to speak into. Thank you, Lord, for this space. And thank you for Michael. In Jesus' name, amen.